So I'm going to cut it all out. You know, I feel very bad because I'm going to introduce Matt McSwain, because you can look at him and he's a retired full bird lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and retired after a bunch of years. That's where I wanted to be, Matt, you know, but you beat us all to it. Came up and started with mass development in February of 2014. He's a graduate of University of Texas in Arlington, hails from Texas, but just bought a home in Andover, so he's one of us. And I've got to tell you, this defense initiative, which SBANE is the only trade organization on the inside working with Raytheon, Textron, General Dynamics, and BAE Systems, it's been a delight and pleasure to work with Matt. He has a tremendous amount of experience, and you know, mass development is doing the planning for anticipation of sequestration and potentially the BRAC closings of the BRAC round, which would include Hanscom and Natick and others. So mass development's really gotten ahead of it and is working on a planning grant and has, you know, some very sophisticated consultants from all over the United States working with him, and he's actually the point person. And we've had some focus groups with Matt, companies that have SBIR grants that are trying to transition their technology. And over the last, since maybe November, I've worked with them very closely, and I thought since defense employs 50,000 jobs, at least in Massachusetts, never mind in New England, real important policy issue that's kind of behind the scenes going on that can hit us right in the face if we're not careful. So I want to introduce our good friend Matt McSwain, who's the, I don't know if they called you the project manager over there or a defense guru or whatever it is, but Matt McSwain from Mass Development.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate the introduction, and truly I'm excited to be here this morning. Thank you very much to all of you for braving the cold and the snow, for coming out this morning. I really appreciate you being here, and I certainly enjoyed meeting some of you prior to the breakfast and hearing about what you're working on and some of the initiatives that you're involved in and your background, and I look forward to talking with some of you after this presentation as well. But as Bob mentioned, I was 22 years Air Force, retired last year, began looking at the afterlife and where I wanted to be post-retirement from the Air Force, and began looking at mass development. Began interviewing with them about a year prior to my retirement. I think I finally wore them down, and they said, fine, please come to work for us. But it's where I wanted to be, and particularly, specifically, I work in the defense sector initiatives. So the defense, obviously, and the Air Force and all armed services are very near and dear to my heart. Mass development, for those of you who are not familiar, we're a quasi-state agency. We work to further the economic development and provide financial support throughout the Commonwealth with the focus on economic development overall and what's good for industry, whatever that industry may be. I work specifically in the defense sector. I was brought on initially to work on a Department of Energy Resources initiative looking at reducing energy intensity and increasing renewables for all of our military installations across the state, all tied to Department of Defense goals. When this project came along, an economic adjustment look from the Office of Economic Adjustment, a section of Department of Defense, I went to my boss and I said, Anne-Marie Dowd, I need this. I would really love to be a part of this because this is near and dear to my heart. For 22 years of a career, about 2/3 of that I flew helicopters, H-1 first and then the HH-60. When my career broadening assignment came along, I looked at, okay, where do I want to go? Business and finance, I've got some of that in my background with my degrees, and that's the direction I wanted to go. So I looked at the at Air Combat Command at headquarters, and there was the helicopter replacement program, the CSAR-X program, to replace all of the HH-60s for the Air Force. And that's where I wanted to be. I called up the director at that time, who was one of my former flying commanders, and said, sir, I'd love to come work for you on this assignment. So From the operator side, walking to the aircraft, having done all of the flight planning and all of the briefing and getting everybody ready to go out for a formation flight, and I would get out there, and on occasion, something wouldn't work, and a lot of times we could work through that. We could use another radio, we could use another something, a backup system, but there were times that we just couldn't fly. And so many times on the operator side, I sat in that cockpit and thought, why can't we get our stuff? Why can't we just get what we need? What's going on? So when it came time for that career broadening assignment, that's when I looked to that CSRX program and said, I want to be a part of that. So the source selection was out at Wright-Patterson, and I remember my first trip out there with the guy that I was replacing for the introductions and to introduce all of the engineers and be a part of that team. And I remember walking into the program manager office, and I looked on one of the walls, and it had the federal acquisition process laid out from one end of the room to the other. And many of you may have seen that process with the milestone A, the milestone B, the milestone C, and all the different colored blocks and all the different layers that have to go into each one of those milestones. And this was a $16 billion program. So we had 6 congressional oversight, we have Office of Secretary of Defense oversight, and I remember looking at that poster, and I said, oh, that's why we don't get our stuff. But it was a real eye-opening experience for me. It was like for any of you that scuba dive, kind of going underwater that first time and seeing that world that's always been there, but you'd never been a part of, and it was real eye-opening for me. So that is one of the things that brought me to mass development and to be in the defense sector and to be a part of this initiative that we're working on now. So for many of you, as we've begun this initiative and we've gone out already and had some sit-downs, some stakeholder meetings, and we've talked about the technology, particularly in the small businesses that we've sat down with so far, I appreciate what each and every one of you are doing to bring this capability to advanced technology and to bring this to the warfighter in the field. And we continue to work on that acquisition process and the different things to get through that piece. But to this project, we've assembled a team about 6 months ago, I would say. We were looking at, I guess longer than that, prior to. We went after a grant with Mass Development for the state to study the impacts of sequestration from a proactive look. To look at some things down the road that are coming and to go out to companies and sit down, what are the impacts and the pressures you're feeling now? What are some of your barriers? And as you look into the future with the defense, the FYDP, the Fiscal Year Defense Plan, what are you seeing and how can we help now begin to formulate this plan? So Massachusetts was awarded a grant to look at this. Connecticut was also awarded a grant, Rhode Island has one, and Maine has one as well. So we're all working on separate, distinct parts of this overall effort, but we are all working very closely together, and we have meetings quarterly with just the 4 states right now to look at this as an overall approach, not just state by state, but as a collaborative effort for the New England region. And I forget exactly the number, how many across the rest of the country that are working on similar things, but I've reached out to many of the other states, Washington, Alabama, Texas in particular, to see some best practices and some things that we should be looking at and focused as well. So we put out an RFP for a consulting team to come in and help us with this. TIP Strategies from Austin, Texas was awarded the contract as a consulting team prime to come in and help us provide this analysis. Very experienced team. They have offices in Austin as well as in Seattle, Washington. Very experienced, very knowledgeable, very sharp team. I've been very impressed with working them so far. Their subprimes, UMass Donahue Institute, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a lot of the research and analysis that they've done on the economic lines in the defense industry as well as many others across the state. Working very closely with them on a lot of the historical reports as well as the economic analysis piece for the spending and the dollars. Chimera Economics and Analytics out of Richmond, Virginia. Chris Chimera and her team are providing the supply chain mapping as well as the asset mapping for Connecticut, who that's part of their grant is the supply chain for not only Connecticut but for the state, as well as helping us on the asset side for Massachusetts as well as the region. And I've got an example of kind of what the asset mapping, kind of the direction we're going. We're on the very early stages of all of this, as we'll talk to in just a minute. But a very impressive team and of consultants and subprimes that we're working with now. When we first sat down and started going through the project scope and talking about this project internally at Mass Development, we looked at who was this going to impact? Who did we want to reach out to be part of a steering committee? One of those organizations obviously was SBANE, and I was introduced to Bob Baker a few months, 4 or 5 months ago, and we sat down and Bob suggested a few of the companies within this organization that I should sit down with also that would be, key and integral members of this organization. So what we wanted was a small group that we could sit down and have some spirited discussions, which we just had our first meeting January 22nd. Very high energy, very enthusiastic, not shy group to talk through these things and really roll the sleeves up and say, what are you feeling? What are your impacts? What do you see down the road? And we wanted a mix of small business, we wanted a mix of the primes, and we wanted a mix of the mids and the smalls. And I think we've pulled together an incredibly talented and experienced and thoughtful group, as evidenced from our first meeting in January. But you see Raytheon and Textron. General Dynamics, we actually have two, Chief of Supply Chain and Chief of Contracts, BAE Systems, Triton Systems, and then SI2 Technologies, and SI2 spin-off out of Triton. But fantastic meeting so far. So they're charged with providing the overall mentorship, assessing the progress, providing guidance and steering, and when it comes to the key decisions on, because we want this to be helpful, we want this to be value added across the board. When it comes to those types of decisions, we're looking to the steering committee to really help us and guide us and to bounce ideas off, to collaborate, to continue to have those spirited discussions, as I know we will. But they will be meeting quarterly for the duration of the grant, and right now the grant runs until about June of 2016. And we'll talk timeline here in just a minute as far as where we are now, what we've done, and then prior to moving into the implementation phase. It's already kind of like a thesis paper. You go in with one question, and you hope, and inevitably it does, drive in about 10 different directions, and that's kind of where we already are in the very beginning stages of this initiative. Another group that we've assembled with many of these organizations we've already sat down with on the initial stakeholder meetings is a Transformational Partnership. We see a lot of key efforts, both on the, tactical side, on the near-term side, as well as on the implementation side, on the strategic side, with this group and the organizations that they represent, as far as providing a second layer of mentorship, of collaborative ideas, of smart thinking, of thoughtful and creative solutions, either policy-wise or program-wise, or anything that we can do once we identify here's problem A, problem B, whatever it is, moving forward with these groups and as we get down the road. So the overall mission with this grant is to provide a proactive response. As I mentioned, we're looking forward before this, trying to get some things in place prior to this actual, these budget cuts and sequestration hitting the street. Proactive response to mitigate potential catastrophic impact of the defense budget cuts and sequestration. When you look at the 5-year defense plan and where we have cut, most of the cuts to date have been in personnel. And we've cut, and we've cut, and we've cut in all services and all branches about as far as we can go to where it really begins to impact the operation, that we can no longer do the mission. Already this year, the last couple of years, there have been flying squadrons in all services that have just run out of flying hours. Typically, when I was on active duty, you'd hit your flying target number, ideally close to the end of your fiscal year, because you knew, okay, you can do some downtime, you can get caught up on maintenance, and then hopefully that next year's flying hours, they'll come in and you can start flying again. The past couple of years now, that date has crept further and further and further away from that FY. So there have been flying squadrons that haven't been able to, there's the currency and there's proficiency. There's two different things. So you can maintain your minimum currency, but if you're not proficient when you go out there, that's when things really start to impact kind of the bigger picture. And that's what we've been running into. So our personnel are about as far as we can get. So what's left? Aging aircraft, so the modernization of the aircraft that are out there, and procurement. That's where a large chunk of what we see coming down the road of where the sequestration, there's really nothing left. And that is where that really begins to impact the supply chain, the assets, everything that's related to the defense industry in supplying the Tier 1 assets, the large primes, particularly impacting that Tier 2 and the Tier 3 and the Tier 4 when those dollars are no longer flowing from Department of Defense or Department of Homeland Security. So our strategic goals as we look out is to stimulate cooperation between statewide and local adjustment and diversification efforts, looking at the supply chain and identifying those downstream companies. Now, again, supply chain specifically, that's within the Connecticut grant, but they are looking, like I said, across the region. That's funded as part of their overall grant. And again, Chimera is the one that's running this for us. Their baseline start for both primarily the supply chain is to look at the primes and the NAICS codes and what's out there in the public spending, the USA spending, I think it's called, but to look at that data and to look at what's available on the public side. What they've done one round of so far is to send out surveys to request where are your supply chains, where are your parts and your pieces coming from. And there was about an 18% response from that initial round of surveys, which actually was quite good. I think of that as, that seems pretty low, but I guess in that world of surveys and this type of modeling at this point, that was a pretty good response. They're formulating a plan for a second round of surveys to dig a little deeper and to come at it from a little bit of a different angle to strengthen those numbers and to increase those data points so that we can really begin to neck down, okay, where are the gaps going to be, where are the gaps now as Program A gets cut or Program B gets cut, what are the trickle-down impacts of those cuts? That is actually that specific piece, that study of the supply chain and where are the gaps is what we're looking at very closely now to request an amendment to this overall grant for Massachusetts so that we can look at the supply chain specifically within Massachusetts, find those gaps, how do we grow those gaps, is there something that we can purchase locally or produce locally, manufacture locally, that we don't have to buy from outside of this region. So that's an amendment that we're kind of already looking at to study. And then also provide business planning and market exploration services, whatever that may be, identifying where those limitations and shortfalls are. Success factors that we've identified that we're looking at as part of this, the thorough assessment of existing defense-related economic base and map the regional assets. Okay, what do we have? What do we have out there now? And getting an understanding of the groundwork, the framework, and the lay of the land. And we're actually, we've been out providing, talking and sitting down at the table with a lot of the stakeholders right now to kind of get that lay of the land and developing that right now. Asset mapping, which I'll talk to you in just a minute, again for both the region as well as Massachusetts. Potential for expanding tech transfer, as well as identify methods to accelerate commercialization. Is there a part or a piece that may be being made for an aircraft carrier or a tank right now that can be commercialized in some way or another? Identify potential for new applications of defense-related products and expanding that customer base. whether it's expanding throughout the region or whether it's expanding into an international side of things. Those are some things that we're exploring, and how do we do that right now, and who do we connect to? Who do we connect the small companies to in order to make this happen, or at least to have that conversation for the opportunity? Integrate and coordinate response efforts with other defense-impacted areas. Hopefully bringing some business here from some of those other impacted areas, and then formulate recommendations and implementation of whatever that strategy is. So kind of a project overview of, breaking down all of those strategic goals and with the overall mission in mind. We're in the discovery stage. We had our initial kickoff meeting internally with the consultants after they were source selected and their primes, their subprimes at Mass Development in October. So we went through their game plan, kind of the timeline, kind of some initial thoughts of where, which path we were going to start off on, and had that initial kickoff meeting in October. The first week of December, the team came back out from Austin, and we assembled everyone, and we had 3 days of stakeholder meetings, which I'll talk to in just a minute, beginning to pull together the different types of assets that the large buckets of the categories that we want to map as far as assets. And when I say assets in particular with the defense industry, it's more of the services, the supply chain, the goods, the assets, the services, and we'll talk to that in just a minute. And then the stakeholder roundtables. Bob pulled together a fantastic group of small business, high-tech companies that we sat down with that week and had, again, very spirited conversation, very thoughtful ideas, and really gave the team from that meeting a lot to think about and a lot to consider. Other organizations that we sat down with, Mass MEP, NEIA, which some of you may be members of as well, workforce development teams, Hanscom and Natick, because they have such a large procurement and contracts arenas locally. And it was a really solid, the team left with incredible level of excitement, and it was much more than they expected coming in. I mean, it was a very solid week of information and conversation, which we pulled together and rolled into that first meeting of the 8 members of the defense team, the steering committee, sitting around the organization. Here's kind of what we're hearing on the ground right now. What say you? And how do we take this information? How do we gel this and put this together into something that's value added and mitigate the impacts of potential defense budget cuts coming down the road? Mass MEP, working with supply chain mapping and outreach. Right now they're working very closely. Connecticut Center for Advanced Technology, they're the grant project managers for Connecticut that are working. They're the prime with the Connecticut grant, but they're working very closely with Mass MEP on a number of different issues as far as the supply chain mapping. And it was an interesting conversation that I had with Dave Modell with Triton Systems, who's actually a member of our steering committee as well. Through my procurement assignment as the operations guy, as the chief of requirements, my whole focus was on technology. I wanted the best, the fastest, the quickest, the coolest, whatever it was. That's where my focus always was, that TRL, 0 to 9. And when the companies were offering, we've got, widget A at TRL 6, the government then assessed the risk assigned to that. But I never, because that was my world, I never really thought, okay, where does the manufacturing side come from? And that manufacturing side, that technology can race through all it wants to. But when you get to a certain point, if you don't have that manufacturing side, what are you going to do? And that piece is what Mass MEP is helping us with as well on a couple of different fronts. And then once you have that intersection of the technology readiness and the manufacturing readiness side of things, then you have that program to provide funding to pull whatever that piece is through the rest of the program. So that's what Mass MEP is helping us with on a couple of things. Tech transfer, the industry growth, identifying areas where we can grow, what might be there, some opportunities that we can look to and explore further, and then also the stakeholder roundtables all the way through this. I believe we have a series of 6 that are part of the grant. The team, I just spoke with them the end of last week. I think it was about 60 degrees down in Austin, but so they're looking forward to coming back out for the second round of stakeholder meetings that I believe will be sometime the first week of March is what we're looking at, and we're beginning to schedule those meetings now to sit down with that second round of stakeholders. And then the third is the implementation stage, which the Office of Economic Adjustment, there's a lot of dollars still sitting on the table right now for the implementation side, both in FY15 and FY16. So a couple of amendments that we're looking at currently, one of them is to study the supply chain gaps, as I mentioned, within Massachusetts. Another one is looking at the SBIR and that technology readiness level of companies getting up to that certain mid-level of technology readiness and not getting over the hump. What are those obstacles? What are those barriers? What can we help with, whether it's a state program, whether it's a manufacturing program? What can we do to help these companies? So we're looking at a couple of things in FY15 for amendment to this grant to request additional funds to look at those things. And then the overall implementation for the main project, we're looking at February, no later than, to request FY16 funds to have direction, to have a strategic look, and to have a strategic plan to go forward with for whatever we can do to help. So activities to date, I've talked to most of these. The kickoff team meeting October, inventory of existing reports, which UMass Donahue has pulled a lot of the defense-related reports and the studies and the analysis together for us. They're kind of our key leaders in that arena right now. Inventory of assets, which is kind of where we are right now, looking at things, and when I say assets, that's the defense, the services provided to the primes, and then the initial roundtable. List of existing reports that UMass has pulled together for us that we're working through currently. Everything to include manufacturing ecosystem to technology to supply chain. Working closely with MIT. So this is a snapshot of 2009 to 2013 of the defense spending in Massachusetts. And the professional, scientific, and technical services, obviously, you know, a large portion of what we do here in this Massachusetts, and we do this very well, all centered around innovation. Innovation and beginning that building and that prototyping and that formulating ideas from, you know, the back of a napkin into something that is prototyped and gets that SBIR funding and then goes on to a larger program. So as we sat and we looked at some different asset categories, which this is still in the formulative stage, and these are just some examples that we've bucketed under each one of these assets to date, but access to capital, venture capital type funding for small businesses in the Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4. Networking, workforce development, organizations. Actually, we sat down with the Advancement Center Workforce Innovation Collaborative and the community colleges throughout, as well as the vocational technical schools on the manufacturing side in particular. Very valuable asset that a lot of companies certainly could be introduced to and collaborate with and see where these areas and in these assets can help those companies. SBIR companies, as I mentioned, we were going to look at a very specific amendment to this just to study, okay, what are the obstacles and barriers? What do you need to get you through that mid-level TRL? University research centers, obviously, the educational capital in this region. Highly desirable place to be and be a part of. Research and development centers like Natick Labs that works on everything to do with the soldier or the airman or the of all services, everything they eat, wear, sleep in, use on deployments. Huge source of research and development at Natick. Tech transfer organizations, and then manufacturing assistance and accelerators, companies like Greentown Labs that have built this collaborative space for entrepreneurs and small companies to come in that need help with software or need help with that development of an idea, to have other companies and leaders of organizations just like them to sit around and collaborate with, and hey, let's go try to build this thing in the small scale prototyping system, those types of organizations. So mapping of assets, this is kind of a draft example of some categories that we're looking at, and this is how it will be reflected as far as those categories. So a value to a company wanting to go in and hit whichever filter they would like to see populate on this map. Where are those companies as far as the organizations? How do I contact these companies or organizations, whatever that's going to be? We want to provide what those companies would need in a very easy place to look, to pull, and to have those numbers and to have those contacts and to begin that collaboration and that conversation across the board, across the state, potentially throughout the region, that they can look to when they need help, that we can point them to this. Roundtables and interviews to date, these are the people that we sat down with and the organizations that we sat down with in the first part of December. And as I mentioned, the first week of March, we'll have our second round of interviews and the second round of stakeholder meetings. Initial findings so far, attracting and retaining qualified personnel at all levels, from the manufacturing side to the mid-level engineers and the machinists. It's been across the board. So you think of a baseball, professional team, and what sustains the pro league. You have all kinds of, the single A, the double A, and the triple A. You have that farm system. So what are some programs that we can begin early on in the educational careers or even the mid-level careers for some, that we can help bring them into the high-tech and the supply chain and the manufacturing industry on a much earlier process to begin that support and sustainment of that of the defense industry. Transitioning from defense to commercial is difficult for contractors. I mean, when you have done your entire business wrapped around the defense procurement, to the thought of, okay, now we're going to transition to a medical field or to something that's commercialized. I mean, that's daunting. When all you have known and you've studied and, part of what you have built your business on. So that's certainly one concern for, okay, if the defense dollars stop and I need to go another direction for the survival of my company, how do I do that? And there's been a lot of expressed concern so far with who we've sat down with. Many expressed the state's program emphasis should be on the SMEs and looking at that specifically and what we can do to help those companies. Consensus that state should focus on its primary strength, the innovation. I mean, obviously you saw where do most of the dollars come into right now, and a lot of it is wrapped around the innovation and the services provided to the defense and the high-tech industry. Technical assistance to clusters of SME manufacturers, and then also concerns that small suppliers won't have the resources to comply with the digital contracting requirements. That's a big push right now in the Department of Defense and the federal acquisition side, is to digitize RFPs. Well, if you're a small company and you don't have that software program, which I understand is quite expensive, just to go in and read the proposal, what are they wanting? Maybe it's something that my company can do, but I don't have the software or the capacity or the capability just to read the proposal. That has been identified in several instances as a real problem as we're moving forward. So we're looking at potential solutions and implementation strategies of how do we provide that basic service. These are some guiding questions. I just wanted to throw these up there. This is one of the slides that we presented to the steering committee that met, that I have forwarded back out to them for their thoughts and to capture those from that meeting. But like I said, the Defense Steering Group, these are the ones that are going to be impacted most by potential budget cuts as well as the sequestration. So what would you like to see from this process? How would you like to see this initiative go and this project? Which direction are we going? Other things that should be included in the input process, because we want to make sure we get everything on the front side that we need to have a thoughtful and value-added outcome on the backside. Are there successful program initiatives in other regions that could be replicated in Massachusetts? That's one of the things that our consulting group out of Texas, they have done a lot of this work for the Office of Economic Adjustment around the country. So they are kind of outside of this region, but they bring a fresh set of eyes and a fresh set of ideas, not only at our own economy and our own processes and our own strengths and weaknesses of our state, but they're bringing that experience in from the other states as well, which has been very much value added to date. Existing programs and assets in the region that we could leverage, that we could build and expand. What are we doing right now that's right? Where are our strengths, and how do we highlight that rather than just a single lens on what are our weaknesses and the sky is falling and what are we going to do? What do we do right? And again, that's where one of those, that innovation, these are some things that we do right. And that certainly is a second lens that we are approaching very carefully and very thoughtfully and aggressively to, is all the things that this region does right, identifying those strengths, and then linking those strengths to the Department of Defense goals of what they want to do as far as acquisition and procurement. That's a strong link and a strong tie that we plan on highlighting every chance we can. Priority customers, and then what is missing? I mean, obviously, what aren't we thinking of? So that was, again, a very good conversation that we had. Looking forward to the next one. Program evaluation questions. What are some programs out there on the technology or the supply chain or the asset side or the manufacturing side that we should be looking at? Other improvements, adjustments, and are these effective? And what's not effective? Maybe we're doing something right now that isn't a whole lot of value added, and that's what we really want to look at with a critical eye and assess, what's the value in this, and what can be changed, what can be tweaked, or what can be eliminated in some cases. So just a basic framework for the recommendations moving forward. The three primary categories that we're looking at right now are either the policy, the direct assistance, or the talent. And looking at those three areas as kind of the pillars as we begin to build an implementation and strategy moving forward. Where do we bucket these efforts, and then what's the best way once we identify those? How do we support those, and how do we build? Project timeline, as I mentioned, this grant is until, I believe, June of 2016. We're on time so far. Things are progressing very quickly. We do kind of feel the pinch of the sequestration looming, so we are really leaning forward in a lot of these areas to look at where do we need to go from here? What are the next steps with the FY15 and the funding that's on the table now? What can we do to identify to help now and to get that started while we continue the grant through its entirety through summer of next year? And with that, I mean, again, I want to thank you for your time and your interest in this initiative. It is something that is obviously very important to both the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, as well as this region, as far as jobs and the economic impact that this industry has and continues to bring to this region. And Bob, thank you very much for inviting me to come here.
Questions for Matt? So the Office of Economic Adjustment in F-15 has about $58 million, and this is for states that get to market the fastest. So, race to the top. These are discretionary dollars. This has nothing to do with base closing money. So Matt really has got a job on his hands, and we hope with our state partners that we can facilitate it. The state has made an enormous contribution to defense already. These are federal dollars, so I have a feeling it's going to be a combination of private, state, and federal to make this adjustment. Sequestration does hit October 1, unless Congress changes the law, and anybody that wants to bet on that, well, that's probably as good a bet as maybe the Red Sox winning the World Series again right now. So it's a little iffy for sure. Any other questions for Matt, since he's point person on this?
So the question is centered around the barrier with the digitized RFPs that are coming out from Department of Defense now. And I'm not sure exactly of the detail of the problems and the type of software or the companies that don't have the software right now. We're still digging into that issue. So I don't have a complete answer to that, other than a few of the companies that we have sat down from, as well as some of the ones from our consulting team, as they have been around the country. That seems to be a real issue that just kind of keeps bubbling up right now in this discovery stage. So we are just at the beginning of delving deeper into, okay, what is the problem there? What is specifically that barrier to entry? And how do we get around that? How do we build the help for that? So I'm sorry, I don't have a complete answer to that question, but that certainly has been one that, when you hear about for the third time, you think, okay, that's something, and we need to find out what. We're actually in the process, in team partnership with Connecticut, that we're working very closely with. They are developing, as part of their grant, it's called the RAID Commons, which is a regional aerospace defense exchange website portal that has all of this information, both for the 4 states that are part of this initiative together. So that has been in the works for a few months now. I saw the first kind of unveiling of that. I went down to Connecticut about a month ago, and they said, okay, here's kind of where we are with what we're doing and the information that we want populated on here, and where do we go with that? And a big part of that conversation is, okay, once we release this, what's the value added to the companies? We want to make sure that that is a value added. And then the broader discussion is the sustainment, because once that grant runs out in Connecticut, what are we looking at to sustain this website? And we want to make sure that it has the value added going in, so that companies and industry sees the need that that's a long-term value added for them. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll be able to publish all of this on a website with the information and kind of where each state is on their initiatives. So hope to see that soon.